Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we picture mid-19th century America, our brains almost instantly go to the battlefields of the Civil War, right? The classic North versus South divide. But what if I told you there was another massive, intense conflict raging right under the surface? Today, we're diving into Chapter 10 of Howard Zinn's classic book, A People's History of the United States, to unpack what he describes as a largely hidden narrative of class struggle.
To really get a solid grip on the argument Zinn is making here, we first have to understand his unique lens. You see, Zinn isn't looking at history from the top down. He's not focusing on the presidents, the generals, or the wealthy industrialists. Instead, he completely flips the script. He's attempting to tell the story from the viewpoint of the working poor, the enslaved, and indigenous populations. It's a fundamental shift in how a nation's timeline is usually presented to us.
So that brings us to the big question. What exactly was this other Civil War? Well, according to the source material, while the Union and Confederate armies were literally battling over the future of the nation and the institution of slavery, there was a parallel war being waged at the exact same time. It was a war of the poor against the rich, an ongoing cross-regional rebellion against the dominant political and economic forces of the era.
To unpack Zinn's arguments, we'll follow this quick roadmap. We're going to look at 1. Redefining American history. 2. The myth of unity. 3. The weaponization of law. 4. The northern working class. And 5. The lessons of 1877. Let's get right into it.
Starting with Section 1, Redefining American History, a New Perspective. Zinn makes this really bold claim right off the bat. He argues that whenever national history is presented as this unified family story, it's actually concealing fierce, repressed conflicts of interest. The text states that nations just aren't inherently unified communities. And frankly, they never have been. When history is taught as the story of one big American family, the source argues it's just covering up the often explosive conflicts between conquerors and conquered, or capitalists and workers.
And this perfectly illustrates the contrast between the official memory of the state and the fractured reality actually experienced by everyday people. The traditional approach, what Zinn might call history of conquerors, is all about emphasizing unity and the achievements of the elite. But Zinn's focus is locked onto the history of the dominated. He argues that it's actually here, in the margins, where you find the unvarnished story of class anger that shaped the daily lives of the majority.
Moving right along to Section 2, the myth of unity enforcing consensus.
Now, Zinn maps out this era to show us that parallel to the North-South conflict, there was this continuous boiling thread of class anger. The Civil War didn't just happen in a vacuum. I mean, look at the timeline. Before the war even started, you had major uprisings like the Hudson Valley tenant strikes in 1839. During the war itself, those class tensions kept right on simmering. And then, right after Reconstruction, massive labor movements exploded onto the scene in 1877.
So the crucial takeaway here is that, according to the source, class consciousness was essentially overwhelmed and suppressed by sheer state force and military unity. The text points out a pretty glaring contradiction. While the Civil War was being proclaimed as a war for liberty, working people who dared to strike for better conditions were literally being attacked by soldiers. Plus, the source notes that an estimated 30,000 critics of President Lincoln's policies were thrown in jail without a trial. 30,000! The unity of the era, Zinn argues, wasn't organic at all. It was heavily enforced by the military and political establishment.
Which brings us to Section 3, the weaponization of law, disguising exploitation.
In this part, Zinn brings in legal historian Morton Horwitz to argue that the modernization of the law actually redistributed wealth away from farmers and workers directly into the hands of commerce. Think about it like this. In pre-modern times, the powerful basically just took wealth by simple physical force. But as America modernized, that exploitation got a disguise. It was now accomplished through a legal system that looked totally neutral and fair on the surface, but was actually engineered to favor men of industry at the expense of everyone else.
Let's look at the real-world impact in Section 4, the northern working class, economics of the era.
Consider this absolute economic squeeze. Prices for basic, everyday necessities, we're talking milk, eggs, cheese, skyrocketed by 60 to 100%. But employers largely refused to bump up wages to match. According to the text, the employers just scooped up nearly all the profits from those higher prices for themselves. This left working families completely stranded, unable to afford the old prices, let alone the newly inflated ones.
And this massive macroeconomic struggle was actually foreshadowed by smaller micro-rebellions. Take the 1839 anti-rent movement, for example. Well before the Civil War broke out, working folks were already organizing. Up in the Hudson River Valley, tenants on this enormous estate basically banded together and just flat out refused to pay back rent. They actually handed a letter to the sheriff saying they were now assuming the right to do to their landlord exactly what he had long done to them. It's a super vivid example of this deep-seated class resentment that existed entirely separate from the issue of slavery.
The source includes this incredibly striking quote from a 19th century laborer. It perfectly captures this intense, boiling anger from workers who felt that, while a war was ostensibly being fought for freedom, the capitalist class was quietly pocketing 5/6 of the country's entire production. To these workers, they were the ones physically creating all the wealth, yet they were the ones stuck suffering under an economic bondage of their own.
Let's see how this all culminated in our final section. Section 5, The Lessons of 1877, A Dual Realization.
Chapter 10 concludes that by the year 1877, both of these marginalized groups realized a really harsh truth. Their separate movements just weren't powerful enough to topple the entrenched establishment. Black Americans, who were facing the total rollback of Reconstruction and rising systemic racism, learned they didn't have the strength alone to make the Civil War's promise of equality a reality. And at the exact same time, the working class, despite all their anger and all their strikes, realized they just weren't united enough to defeat the incredibly potent combination of private capital backed by government power.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to reflect on Zinn's thesis for a second. Consider how uncovering these deeply repressed narratives might shift your entire perspective on the past. By examining history not just as a neat timeline of presidents and unified national causes, but as this really messy, complex web of class struggles and competing interests, we get a much more nuanced view of how modern society was actually built. It really begs the question, what other historical unities are actually just masking deeper, unresolved conflicts? Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.